That Podcast Network and the It's Me Speaking to You podcast presents a podcast series for the archives. I talked to the producer and director of the Tupac Assassination series, as well as the latest groundbreaking Docu Series, Tupac Cover-Up. RJ Bond comes and talks about his many years researching and reporting on this case. And we will go episode by episode, breaking it all down. It has been way too long, and there are still way too many unanswered questions. Buckle up. You do not want to miss this. All right, we are off to the races, man. Really, really excited about this one. This is one of those subjects. I mean, obviously, it's back in the news. Did it ever leave? It's been 30 years, and we're still talking about this case. I'm so thankful for him taking the time. You know, I love these deep dives on these kind of conversations, and he's been dealing with this subject and in this subject for so long. So he really is an authority on this subject. He is the creator, producer, director of the Tupac series, the Tupac Assassination series, Tupac Assassination, Tupac Day of Reckoning, Battle for Compton. And he was also affiliated with the executive producer of, I believe, Last Man Standing with Nick Broomfield. Mm-hmm. And that's really what got me into this subject. I remember exactly where I was when Tupac was shot. I remember a week later exactly where I was when I heard he passed away. And it was, you know, obviously a blow to all of us who was a fan. But the bug really bit me in 2002, I believe it was, with Nick Broomfield, Biggie, and Tupac. I got to meet Gene Deal, come to meet to make the acquaintance of Gene Deal, and just the whole story. And then from there, I've been digging into it too. And for every answer I think I have more and more questions. But he's been doing his best to break it down. Like I said, he's got the Tupac Assassination series, and he has the latest Tupac Assassination cover-up series, which is on Zumo now. Man, RJ Bond is with us today. What's up, brother? And thank you so much for taking the time.
How you doing, brother? Well, I suddenly felt old, because I've been around that long. It's greetings to you. Like I said, I actually don't feel old, but that boy, you make me feel like I've been around forever.
Well, we're not getting older. We're getting better, brother.
That's right. Yeah, no, Tupac Cover Up is definitely on Zumo Play. It's not a channel that a lot of people automatically just think about, but it's out there. It's owned by Comcast and Charter. So it's definitely a big player. They're kind of an up and comer. They're trying to take over Tubi's space. So they were happy and very happy to have us approach them and say, hey, would you mind taking the show? And that was actually kind of a big deal because we had just had a battle with Tubi that Tubi put us out, and then based on some people that had made some complaints about it, they wanted us to go in and make some editorial changes to the show. And, which is kind of unheard of, especially once you've gone to air. Normally, traditionally, a station will, they'll kill you with the cuts and they'll kill you with the notes, and you change it and change it and change it till finally everybody's happy, and then you put it out, and then you never hear anything more from it. But in this particular case, they took it as is. They had plenty of opportunity to screen the movies or the shows, and they didn't. And they got some complaints. I guess I don't know if they panicked or what happened, but they said, well, you need to make these changes X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And we said we weren't going to, and they said, well, you have to make those changes, otherwise we're going to keep it off the air. And then they told us, and I started thinking about it, thought about doing it. Then they told us, they hit us with the knockout blow. They said, if anybody else complains, that we're going to come back to you, we're going to pull it back off the air again, and we'll ask you to make more changes. And if you don't make those changes, then we'll keep it off then too. And I said, well, that's just not workable. When you spend tens of thousands of dollars advertising for a show, and right, you direct people to go there. I spent probably $30,000 just on Google advertising by itself for Google to go to the trailer that promotes it on Tubi and then not have it there when people go. That's bad. That's a bad sign. So Zumo was happy, and they said first thing out of their mouths we're not going to ask you to make any changes to the show. We love it. And if there's any problems or anybody complains, we'll let you deal with that. We won't get in the middle of that. Period.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you addressed that because I was going to ask because originally, and I've heard people and I've seen people online like, where is this on Tubi? I can't find it on Tubi because, like you said, the trailer is all pushing people towards Tubi. But like
Yep.
you said, because of a variety of reasons, it is now over on Zumo.com. Check that out, Zumo.com, and then just punch in Tupac cover up. I've watched it, I don't know, several times, and I'm sure I'll watch it a lot more
Wow.
as this progresses. And again, RJ is being so very generous at this time, and it's a 6-part series. So each week we're going to break down each episode. And again, there's so much information in this. It is so dense. And I'm not comparing myself to you as far as the research, but I've been in this for a long time. So I have to discipline myself to keep myself focused on each episode.
It's hard to do. It's
It
hard to
is.
stay on a subject. It really is because this is a nine-headed monster.
Yeah, I mean, and I got into this quote unquote conspiracy stuff years ago when I was like 16. It reminds me of JFK because there's so many names, so many dates, so many layers to this. But again, we're going to focus on each episode. But before we get into it, man, I'm kind of a comic book fan, if you will, and I love a good
Mhm.
origin story. Tell me a
Mhm.
little bit about where Audrey Bond came from and when did this bug bite you about this particular case?
Well, I think my original involvement, well, I mean, my involvement with everything generally kind of goes all the way back to 97. Right after the shooting of Tupac Shakur, probably maybe 6, 7 months afterwards, I was introduced to Frank Alexander by a mutual friend of ours, Rob Castle, who was a guy that he was my boss, but Frank was training him at the gym, and for some reason, Rob just thought you guys would get along perfect. You'd hit it off, and he invited us to get together at the Orange County Fair that year, and we did. And he was absolutely right. Frank Alexander and I were just the yin and yang. I mean,
Before
there
we get
was
started,
there.
RJ, you're used to these names, and so many people are used to these names. But as I've talked to Don Sikorsky, Johnny the Greek, what's up, Johnny? There's so many names that we're so used to saying. Let's qualify these
Yes.
names. Who
Well,
is Frank Alexander?
Frank Alexander was Tupac's bodyguard that was there the night that he was shot, and he was his primary bodyguard for the year, the last year of his life, for the most part. And so I got to introduce to Big Frank, as they called him, Tupac's
Yeah.
bodyguard. And what was interesting is that Rob never introduced Frank to me as that. It was just, this is Frank. He's a guy who trains me at the gym. Good to meet you. And personality wise, we just hit it off. And it really wasn't until maybe a few weeks in that I was talking with Rob. He goes, hey, that guy Frank that you met, he was Tupac's bodyguard. I said, really? And he goes, yeah, he was there when he was shot. And of course, I said the same thing everybody else says. It's like, well, he wasn't much of a bodyguard then. That's
Ouch.
always the go-to, right? And I've heard that so many times. I mean, that we got punked in New York really bad about that when we did the Wendy Williams show. But but he said, yeah, he was there, and he's got quite a story to tell. And we hung out, friends, didn't really do anything business wise or do anything about the Tupac story. I mean, I really Tupac wasn't even a really a big part of our conversation. I lived with Frank. We shared a house in Corona. And all that time, it was just kind of like what was going on at the time. We didn't really get into I mean, I knew about his relationship with Tupac, but it just really wasn't anything that we were really doing anything about. We were just friends. We were just buddies. We just hung out together, had a great time. And I'm glad for that because honestly, our relationship wasn't based on the whole
Right.
he was Tupac's bodyguard. And I'm thankful for that because I think as we moved through the investigation, as we moved through his life on the planet, that the basis of our friendship, because it wasn't founded in that, when there was issues or struggles regarding that, it didn't affect the overall friendship. We were still friends first. And that's really important because you meet a lot of people these days that you meet uh because of the investigation. You mean, and they're
Right.
dear friends, and Nikki and John and Don are dear friends of mine, but I met them because of the investigation. So that's really what we have in common. With Frank, it was a different story. Frank and I just met as friends at the fair. We had my boss, who was his student at the gym. That's kind of what we had in common. So we really didn't base any of our friendship on that entire subject matter. So flash forward a few years, I was actually in the Midwest. I had moved to the Midwest, and I was actually shooting my first feature film. It's called Ghost Factory, and, and yes, it is out on Amazon and Google Play and um, couple other channels out there. But it's on the streamers. The movie's called Ghost Factory. Um, I was shooting that in 2002, and I called Frank because he was actually thinking about buying a house in Kentucky where I lived. And I said, "Hey, I got a part for a security guard guy, a bailiff in a courtroom scene. Do you want to come out and do it?" And he said, "Of course I want to do that. Of course I want to do it." So he first words of the film are actually Frank's voice. But um, when he came out and we were shooting that, he had made mention of the fact that he had done a video DVD that was about to come out. This is we're going back now. This is like 2004, I think. And he had mentioned he had done a DVD. And I didn't know much about it because, again, I was doing my thing in Kentucky and we were still in communication, but we really weren't in each other's hair at that point. We talked a couple times a week. But he had said he'd done a DVD and that it had done very well. And the DVD was called Before I Wake, Tupac Shakur Before I Wake. And it was his story. And that it had done pretty well, and that the distributor actually wanted him to do a follow-up to it and basically do back in the days when they did the expanded version of a DVD, where like,
Right.
yeah, let's take some extra interviews and let's put some stuff in there.
Right.
Um, so he said, why don't we, they're bugging me about doing that since you're the film guy and I'm not, and you're the and to be honest with you, a fair shake on Before I Wake was it was what we call shower curtain interviews, where it was like you rent a hotel room for the day, you shuffle a bunch of people in and out, and
Yeah.
they do interviews, and it wasn't in my view, from a technical perspective, it was almost unwatchable, but the information was so good, it was there.
The flowery background, the drapes there, those were
Yeah,
the
right.
pink,
Yeah,
yeah, the pastel.
exactly. The bad wallpaper,
Yeah.
it's just the tacky wallpaper. And of course, everybody wasn't lit right, so their faces were all red like they'd been on a binge 3 days earlier, things like that. So when these guys get in there and Frank says, "Hey, and apparently he had a falling out with his cousin who shot it or whatever. He said, "I have a couple more interviews that I have, and I wouldn't mind, using those and doing that." And I said, "Well, Frank, why? I mean, I'm just thinking as your friend, I'm just thinking out loud. Why would you add more content to a SKU that's already out? If you have enough content that you can do that, maybe it'd be better for you to do another product like a Before I Wake Part 2 or do something else because now you've got two SKUs out there and you can make money off two DVDs where basically it's just your distributor telling you, hey, put more in it so that we can milk it for a little more money." I said, people aren't going to buy your DVD three times. It's not going to
Right.
happen. They're going to buy it once, maybe twice if they're a hardcore fan. But if you create an all new SKU, everybody who bought your last one will take a look at buying your next one. So, oh, that's a good idea, he said. Okay, so then he went back to LA. Didn't hear much about it. I came out shortly thereafter. I was out in LA. Of course, he and I was running around together when I was out in LA. And as we're driving down the road, he says, "What if I told you I knew who Tupac's killer was?" How do you not bite on that one?
Seriously.
Nah, I don't care. I
Yeah,
don't care.
exactly.
Who the hell is he anyway? Who's Tupac? I don't give a shit. Honestly. So okay, all right, I'll bite. Okay. What if we said, okay, well, you've said it. He says, well, I have this footage that I did some interviews, and I have another bodyguard, Michael Moore, who I interviewed, and I was too afraid to put it out before because the people that I think are responsible for it, I don't want to get shot. I don't want to get, you know, I don't want to be dead. And of course, and he goes, and I have all these phone calls that I recorded. I've got all of this information, the things to support it. And I said, you got to do another DVD. Sounds like to me, you better do another project. And well, and so I said, well, let me listen to what you got. And I went to his house and I listened to everything, watched everything, listened to everything what he had. And I was like, dude, are you effing kidding me? I said, this has got to go out. This stuff has to go out. And he goes, okay, I'm glad you hit that. And of course, we had zero cash to do anything with. I mean, you see it. I see the movie now. Somebody asked me if I wanted to upres it and put it back out again. The first Tupac assassination, conspiracy or revenge. And I started laughing because I actually went back to watch it, and the quality was just so bad that I was like, "Oh my God, I actually put that out. Who would have thought it? I'd never put that out now." But we did it. We got it out. Um, the show came out. It did really good business for Universal, did really good business for our distributor. We're talking in the millions. And of course, we never saw a dime of it, Frank and I. We got screwed really bad. Ended up in a 3 year long federal court case over it. We ended up seeing a little bit of money in settlement towards the end, but after you've got 3 years worth of attorney fees and court costs and litigation and all that, what we saw was probably 10%, if that, of what the money that was made from the DVD for the short period that it was out. People think that movie's been on sale for a long time. The first Assassination movie, Jeff, was I don't think it was out on the shelves for more than maybe 6 months because we had an injunction. The court gave us an
Mm,
injunction to stop selling the movie. So Walmart and all the other ones had to take it down off the shelf. That's why it's hard to find, because we literally told the court, if we're not going to see any money from it, why sell it?
right.
And that's what we did. So that's a little bit about that, my history there, and how that all came, and that's what just got me into the whole thing. Once I got into the assassination first one, everything else was just kind of subsequent to that. We started digging deeper into this. I became much more interested in how this all went down circumstantially, not
Right.
necessarily with the intent of looking at a liability, but just looking at the circumstances of it and saying, okay, how did this even happen in the first place?
And
So,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
And like they're in 30, almost 30 years later, me personally, I have my considerations suggest certain things, almost like JFK or whatever. But since I wasn't there, it's all kind of very circumstantial and you got to kind of put it together. But you have put these puzzle pieces together so well. And I mean, over the years, and especially in this Tupac cover up, I mean, it really synthesizes all the other kind of information and stuff you've done and a lot of the other documentaries I've seen. But
Did you feel like it was a rehash? I mean, I know that there are certain things that you kind of have to go over to tell the story again, but I'm hoping that it doesn't come off to the fans like that it's a rehash of Assassination, either any of the Assassination movies. There's certain elements there and certain things we had to replay, but I'm hoping that it doesn't come off like it's just another exploitation
well, no, not at
piece.
all. But and like you said, like you just said, in order to tell this story, you do have to mention names. Like you have to say certain things more than once because to put everything in context. And that's I'm glad this kind of broken up 6 part series we're going to do and what you did the docu series really does break this up and makes it so much more comprehensive because there's a lot of layers to this, man. There's a lot of stuff going on that again still has me scratching my head. I mean, especially episode one. I mean, we're going to get into it here, but it episode one kind of makes you think like, okay, this is a Suge thing. But as you go on and you get into more stuff, it's like, all right, it's more than just Suge, if Suge at all. But anyway, episode one, guys. Again, Tupac cover up, Zumo, check it out. This one, I mean, it starts out, and again, it's a slow roll, it's not a rehash. It's an introduction to a lot of these players who play a crucial role in this. And so we're kind of going to go over this as episode one unfolds. We're getting
Death
introduced
Row
to, I guess,
Realities. That was the name of
Death
it.
Row Realities. Thank you,
Death Row
thank you.
Realities is episode one. So, all right. So we were talking about, we're kind of getting into episode one here.
Yep,
Um,
episode one, Death Row Realities, as you introduce a lot of the players who we will hear later on, a lot of people who were in Tupac's life at the time and had been in his life, people he's worked with on projects, business partners, etc. Kick it off for me.
well, okay. So when we talk about episode one, Death Row Realities, this episode, it's going to be the first thing that people see. It's really, I treated it like it was kind of a pilot episode. And I have to explain this in a way because it didn't start off that way. The entire series was going to be an hour and a half show. It was going to be a movie, just like the assassination movies. In fact, it was going to be called Tupac Assassination 4. But as I started going through and we started getting a great producer, Edna Sims, that worked with me, started hooking me up with different people that were willing to talk and all of that. As we were building the story more and more, it just got bigger. It got to a 4 part series, where it was a 4 hour movie, I should say, at that point. And then I talked to my distributor, like, well, why don't you just make a docu series out of it? Oh, okay, it's that simple. Sure, why not? And and then off we went, which is it is a nightmare because when you do anything in multiples of six, and you have that means you've got to come up with a beginning and an end for each, so six different episodes, and then you have to QC six different episodes, and you have to get the sound for six different episodes. It becomes six different movies almost. So
Right.
it's a very arduous, tedious test of your patience. At any rate, though, when we did the first one, I had already kind of set up with the interviews that I was doing. We and it has everything to do with the title too. I saw as we were starting to develop the show that this stopped being about Tupac assassination. This stopped really being about who killed Tupac. It became more of a story of why do we have all of the noise that we have, and how do we cut through that and eliminate that to get to whatever the truth is going to be? Because you really can't, Jeff, you can't really look at the who killed Tupac that simply, because there's
No.
been 30 years worth of noise, 30 years worth of stories, 30 years worth of ambiguities, some of which are just finally starting to get ironed out, that get in the way of that.
Absolutely.
It's like you got to cut through 15 layers of sheet metal before you can get to the heart of it. And so one of the ideas that we had to begin with was, well, let's look at the popular narratives about Tupac's relationship with Death Row, because to talk about the shooting and to talk about Tupac's death, there were a lot of people, and even in the assassination movies, that have tied his unhappiness with Death Row Records to a plot to have him killed because they could get the royalties from the albums that he was making, and that he was upset about his royalties, and really was he going to leave Death Row Records? And there's just so much there. And I thought, how do we address this the best? Because, there's been a lot of people that have had opinions about it. I mean, you get on your Vlad TVs or your Art of Dialogues and these other shows that they interview low-level rappers that may have gone in for 5 minutes to do one verse with Tupac, and so suddenly they're Tupac's best friend, if you know how that goes.
Right.
Um, and they have presented these, what I call hood stories, hood lore, generalizations, what they'd heard, rumors, speculation, and all of that, but from a very, very low level, like you wouldn't know anything because you don't interact with anybody on a daily basis. So how do you really, how do you have the stripes to be able to talk about it? Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Cloud chasing, I guess they call them nowadays.
Yeah, that's what they call it now. Yeah, that you can offer up an opinion about this because somehow you feel like you've got value in the conversation. And so when we started to map out how we were going to flow this now ridiculously long movie, and we're going to break it up into parts, the first part I said was, the first thing we got to cut through is what's truth and what's BS
Hmm.
about a lot of the legend and the lore. I mean, it's 30 years now. It might as well be the legend of Santa Claus because there's just so much lore around it. So much, that's been tied to it. Now you got accusations of women being raped with a remote control because they said something about Tupac. I mean, this is the how dumb
Right.
it's gotten.
Right.
So the first thing, and that's why it was called Death Row Realities, is because we wanted to look at many of the things that I had been told, even by people close to Tupac, about, well, he was unhappy at Death Row Records. He was unhappy about it. Why was he unhappy with Death Row Records? Well, because of this XYZ. And having had our own distribution and distributors and understanding how that all works, I thought it was important to get the adults in the room, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And that was the mandate that I gave to Edna and to our bookers, is to say, I need interviews with people that are not they're not your artists. They're not rap artists. They're not people that may have dipped into the art studio at one point. We have enough of those. Let's talk to the people that were working in the office every day that could see what was happening. That's where we got Kevin Black, the A&R guy from Death Row Records. Great guy. We had even people that, unfortunately, Mike Nixon, who was Death Row's publicity guy and was the one that was in charge of the street teams and giving out the posters. He gave me some amazing Death Row posters, including the almost impossible to find Death Row Christmas album poster. And so that was neat. But Mike actually didn't even make the final cut. His interview got cut. But all of these people, Cynthia Horner with Right On Magazine, Billy Johnson, all of these people that were there at the time that were, I won't say objectively, but I guess that is a regular word to use. They were objectively covering the situation. They were
Right.
objectively seeing what was going on. Kevin Black knew what was going on. Kevin Black, talked about the relationship with Frank Alexander that everybody knew. If you wanted to get Tupac to do something, you talked to Frank Alexander about it. Frank
Right.
got him where he needed to go. Smart move. That was and Frank had always said that he had a great friendship with that. So we wanted to get people, and Michael T. Williams, I think, was probably our biggest celebrity get, because, and not because he was a celebrity in his own right. Michael T. Williams played Bubba Gump in
Yeah.
Forrest Gump, and he was in the movie Heat, and recently he's been on Fallout, I think was the show he's been on most recently. But the thing about Michael T. that intrigued me was that Michael T. was actually Tupac's acting coach and mentor during all of that time.
Right.
So the work he was doing with the Jim Belushi gang related, the other movies that he did, Juice, all that, Michael T was right there at that time and was really mentoring him and trying to teach him the difference between life on the street and life in Hollywood, life in entertainment, and trying to be a different kind of creature in
Right,
that
and trying to
aspect.
push him to something that was going to be a little bit more sustainable than the
Yeah, a
world he
little
was
higher
marinating
minded.
into.
Right,
Yes,
exactly. A
exactly.
little more higher minded pursuit. And so, and not to deal with the lunacy, and like he said, he walked away from it at one point because it
Right.
was just crazy. But I wanted to get a stable of people that really you'd never hear from generally, and I got it. I felt like Death Row Realities was a great examination of what you've heard, and then now let the person who knows the most about it talk about it objectively.
Right.
So, case in point, we had a wonderful lady named Jeannie Jennings that came on and did a great interview with us. And she was very clear about how labels play games with the artists and their royalties. And it's not uncommon for an artist. And in fact, Frank and I kind of fell into that same hole with our distributor, where there was some sort of a belief that you were going to get paid pretty quickly after a product dropped. So if you were releasing a record or a movie and a month goes by and you haven't been paid, why haven't I got paid for this movie? That's pretty common actually with artists that don't know any different and they've
Right.
never really been walked through the contract that they signed, that it can be 6 months, 8 months, a year sometimes before you get paid for a product that you've put out to market. And in January, you may not get paid until December or January of the next year. In
Well,
some
that's why
cases,
when you said you were having trouble, you and Frank were having trouble with your distributor in the beginning. I'm like, wow, this reminds me of the chaos that was going on at Death Row. Work for not the lack of work for hire agreements and just paperwork being wrong. And I say that so oftentimes, if your paperwork's wrong, you're fighting a very uphill battle. And the young lady you just discussed, Janie Jennings, the industry exec from AMC Music, she was explaining that on how basically these artists are indentured service to a lot of time. They're not allowed to escape because they're kept in debt constantly.
yeah, the cycle of debt. Yeah, I think that was very well broken down, and so for Tupac to be take getting $5,000 as he called it, get five, and Frank would talk about the office would come down, run down, and get five. Those were all advances. That was
Right.
not his royalties. And sure, had he earned the money, of course, nobody's disputing that. But it's how long did they have Interscope and Death Row Records? How long did they have to actually hold on to that money before Tupac would actually get paid to where he had his own money and he wouldn't have to worry about five anymore because he had millions in the bank, that type of thing. And so because again, if you believe that there was a hit put on Tupac by Death Row because Tupac was owed royalties and they didn't want to pay him, well then you better explain how royalties work. That was kind of where we came from with that. So we wanted to get through a lot of the conversation topics regarding Tupac's relationship with Death Row. Like for example, Suge Knight. Was Suge Knight this big bad guy, the terror of Death Row Records and all that? my view on that has changed a lot over the years, in part based on conversations I've had with many people like Papa G, George Price, who was Death Row Records publicist. He was very quiet around Death Row offices. The studio was in a different location, and that was a little bit more of a three-ring circus, but the Death Row Records offices themselves were pretty quiet. And he said when Suge would come in, he'd bring his entourage, and it would kind of get out of hand for a little while, but then it was fine. A lot of these people were feeding back that same thing that Death Row Records was a business. They were actively out there trying to sell. They were actively working with distributors of their own and merchants and retail and how to get the best word out about the product. And so it became very clear to me that there was clearly some I don't want to make sure I call it disinformation or misinformation, but just a misunderstanding, I think, by a lot of people in this whole narrative about that Tupac was actually owed money, as in he was expecting money to be paid to him that day, versus he was owed money, but he wouldn't see it for a year. That
Right.
changes the complexion of the entire conversation because if you picture Tupac as the victim, as a guy who's literally being ripped off, then you have a different, then yeah, you can understand why somebody might do a plot to steal the rest of his money or never pay him because they shoot him. So you get that's a theory that's out there.
Well, and part of that chaos that ensued is based off Tupac recognizing he was being robbed, and he was auditing Death Row and recognizing that there was invoices there that were charging him for stuff that he didn't even do. It
Right.
was
And that
he was
was
robbing him.
actually before, he was even supposed to get paid. From what Jenny was telling me, that it could be 6 months before you get paid. I mean, Pac wasn't even on the record album for the label for a year.
Right.
But when you have that money that's due, what Tupac was hearing, and he made it very clear that certain people's child support was being advanced and paid out of his royalty
Nate
account.
Dogg.
Yeah, Nate Dogg's child support was being paid out of that. And he heard that there was a lot of things besides his own, to his own benefit, that was being bled out of his account. Now, do we know that that's true? No. We don't know. Okay. We don't have that level of accounting from Death Row Records. That the audit that he wanted to do, of course, never came from anything. And it always cracks me up because every time Greg Kading, the LAPD detective that investigated the case some years later, he kept calling it a tax audit. Like that Tupac wanted to do a tax audit on Death Row Records. And he's like, well, why would Tupac want to do that? I'm like, well, okay, then you're an idiot. You don't understand what a record label audit really is.
Another
And,
name we can't just overlook, Greg Kading,
yep. Former LAPD
very,
detective.
very much so responsible for the mis and disinformation you talked about in the beginning. Yeah, as you just said, former LAPD detective. Let me say that again, LAPD detective, but yet Tupac's case happened in Las Vegas. So what's that about? But here's how Greg Kading moves and what he's about. Here's how up and up of a cop he is. He was a part of this trial by the gentleman by the name of George Torres Ramos, and this case wound up getting thrown out, and this killer wound up getting off because Greg Kading was complicit with tampering with witnesses. So that's the
Yep.
kind of cop Greg Kading was.
And we'll talk about that when we get over to episode 4. We'll
Yeah,
talk about
absolutely.
that.
I'm
We'll
just trying to
talk more
qualify
about
these
that.
these characters' names.
Yep. So anyway, so Kading was this cop. But anyway, long story short was that uh the story about Tupac wanting to audit Death Row Records. Did he really do that? Did he really fire um did he really fire David Kenner? Did he really fire Reggie Wright and Right Way Protective Services? All these things. And you hear all these things. So what the idea of part one was to say, okay, let's try to get the people that might be most knowledgeable about it to talk about it. So and to also have attorneys and people that understand the subject matter to help explain it so that you understand it. And like I said, the thing about I've spoken with Suge Knight several occasions. And from what I hear, he's rather upset with me now because there's a part in there where Virgil Roberts, who's the attorney that got Dr. Dre, a recording artist that was one of the founders of Death Row Records, actually got him away from Death Row Records because he didn't want to be around it anymore. That Virgil Roberts said that they called Sugar Buster, which is basically no one to be afraid of. A Buster's hood talk for
Right,
somebody
right.
that's not no threat. And apparently Suge's upset about that, that he was that I let that in stay in the movie, that he was called a buster. But one of the things I'm trying to explain in it is that no one's perfect. And Suge Knight, if he's not this terrible, mean person, let's put it this way. Let me give you the inverse of that. If Suge Knight was this terrible, mean person that he'd just as soon look at you as shoot you, okay? Do you really think that Reggie Wright and um, the risky Ron Brent, the artist that manufactured a death row stamp with Suge Knight's signature on it, that was a forged signature, but they used that to stamp checks? Whether or not Suge knew about it or not, it's another story. But if Suge was that big and bad of a person, do you think those cats would have even tried to forge his signature? Do you understand what I mean? So if you are let's a Colombian drug lord, okay? Let's say you're Pablo Escobar, okay? What do you think would have happened to him if somebody would have forged his name on a bunch of checks?
Not that it matters, but was this prior to him being locked back up? I mean, not that he can't touch people in jail, but was this prior to, were they starting to use these rubber stamps to put all this
This
stuff
is
in Reggie's
this
name?
was once he went to jail.
Okay.
Okay, once he went to jail. But as you just pointed out, take Pablo Escobar. Okay, there are many people's reach who go way outside of the jail.
Yeah.
Okay, and if Suge Knight was this big and bad guy that would just as soon kill you as look at you, okay, which Frank and a lot of people actually kind of thought that about him. They kind of gave him that kind of reputation, and I can't lie and say that the first Assassination movie didn't have a tinge of that in it, that Suge Knight was a bad dude and was somebody that, you should really be afraid of. And but to hear Virgil Roberts, who's an old attorney now, who got Dre out of his contract, turn around and say that, Suge was a buster. Well, if people think that about you, then they're more likely to do things around your back and to get away with doing some bad acts because they're not afraid of you. Okay. And that makes perfect sense. Why is it that Reggie Wright even now is saying horrible things about Suge Knight and saying that he has, VD, and saying the things that he says about him? If Suge Knight were that big and bad of a guy, why isn't Reggie Wright 6 feet under?
Hmm.
Okay.
Again, to qualify names, Reggie Wright, Reggie Wright Jr., whose father, Reggie Wright Sr., was the head of like the Compton gang unit. Reggie Wright Jr. was the head of Right Way Security, which was the security for Death Row Records.
Right.
It's a very good point. That's a very good point. It's
Yeah. And so in doing the documentary and trying to give everybody a fair shake, and like I said, I know it pissed Suge Knight off, but we tried to get it to say there's a level of fairness about it. So, what was Tupac owed money when people were saying that he was mad and wanted to do an audit of Death Records? Probably not. Did it mean that he didn't have a right to know where he was going to, or where his money was going? Yes, he did. But did he have the right to do that audit? We're not really even sure about that,
hmm.
because he had that really lousy contract with Death Row's attorney, and like the 3-page contract, and it contracts are usually what give you those rights. So
The Death Row
as
attorney David Kenner, who we're going to get into later on down the line.
right,
That guy's he's a
yep,
piece of work.
he is. And so when you look at the construct of the first episode, what we really wanted to try to do, again, reduce the noise level, turn it down a little bit so you can hear the adults in the room talking.
Hmm.
Not the kids. Now the adults are talking. We're saying, okay, yes, he was. What do people say? He was upset. He wanted out of Death Row Records. Well, maybe he wasn't. Maybe in his mind, he thought he had the right to do it. Well, did he really have the right to do it? Well, I don't know. So we try to cut through that. Michael T did a great job of talking about Tupac, and when he got his first tattoos, and saying, well, you need to take the actor's journey, Tupac. You need to take the actor's journey, where you don't taint yourself up with tattoos all over your body, because it takes somebody forever to put makeup on to cover them all up. And you don't want to get your ear pierced, because if you're doing an old Western, somebody's going to work overtime trying to keep that hole in your ear filled up. I mean, this
Hmm.
is this is the idea. Michael T, I think, even said every time you travel someplace, you take a suit with you because you never know if you're going to run into a
Right.
government dignitary or anybody else, person of interest. So, I think there was a lot of conversation in that first episode. It's a pretty dense episode.
It definitely is.
But it definitely, I think, deconstructs a lot of the superstitions, a lot of the hood stories. I mean, later on we talk about the Lakewood Mall, which was an event that allegedly was in the narrative to trigger the ultimate shooting of Tupac Shakur. It's in that whole storyline. But we had to start with saying, okay, was Tupac being reasonable in his expectations of wanting to do this audit?
Mm.
Where was Tupac's expectations in there, and was it really something that, I mean, people just kind of take it like Jeff. They kind of take it like, well, yeah, he could have done an audit and he should have done an audit and he didn't get a chance to, and that's why he got shot. Well, if the reality is that he didn't really, that wasn't even a thing that he could
Yeah.
do at that point in time. He wasn't entitled to do it. And then maybe all this steam about the fact that he wanted to do it was just nothing more than Tupac hyperbole, that he was just making noise about stuff. And
And that's definitely a consideration. I never even thought about that, the veracity of this audit and how much they were stealing from him. And I'm not an insider of the business, and I think you're right.
we weren't there.
It takes
Yeah.
time to get your money back. But regardless of the audit was legitimate or not, from what I understand from people who were close to him, like Tracy Robinson, Glow, his aunt, he was not planning to stay with Death Row. He had a 3 album deal, and that's why I always find interesting when Pac got out. He's like, man, he was in the studio every day, man. He was just such a just creative genius, just pumping it out, pumping it out. I think the way it sounds, checking the temperature on the vibe that was going on there, he was just trying to get these albums done. All Eyes on Me, and then Machiavellian. He was supposedly out, and he had set up to create up Out of the Gutter Records, Machiavelli Records, Euthanasia, which was the management company. It sounds like he was exiting, regardless
Yeah.
if he was auditing or not. It sounds like he was dipping out.
Well, and that was something else that we wanted to clear up in the episode too. Do we have de facto evidence or testimony that, yeah, that was the plan? And I think Cynthia Horner kind of nailed that, because here we are, she's completely outside the whole death row loop.
Right.
She's a publicist from New York. She comes in and she overhears this conversation, and Tupac's upset and he's saying he's going to leave, and in George Price's office, and George Price, again, the head of death row publicity.
Papa G, who you
Yeah,
mentioned a little
Papa
bit
G.
ago.
And Cynthia Horner comes in, and she knows nothing. So there's really no reason for her to lie, but I think she just
Right.
knows what she heard.
Right.
And she did that. But for it to get to that level of exposure, it's not just his family members. And that's why I thought it was important when Cynthia said that, because it's not just his family members or people who, I don't know, I don't want to say they have a conflict of interest, but they kind of do, because if you love your family and you're rooting for your family and you're on their side, whatever they say must be true, or whatever they say must be valid. And so you hear them say Tupac was going to leave Death Row, but then you say, well, that's coming from everybody on Tupac's family and confidants and all that. Okay, maybe that's true. But then when you hear it from a neutral third party who's got no skin in the game at all,
Right.
yep, he was leaving. I heard him on the phone. He was screaming and yelling about it. He wanted out. I think that's the best corroboration that you can get. You
Right.
know, it wasn't so much that we had so many people. We had a whole chorus of people singing that Tupac was going to leave Death Row Records. What we needed was somebody who wasn't part of Tupac's side of the camp, that heard or saw something that was evident to that. And again, this has everything to do with even the shooting of Tupac. Jeff, when you think about witnesses, okay, you may have witnesses that are there and have personal firsthand knowledge, but then who's the best witness? Well, it's the guy standing on the street corner that's got no reason to say anything different than what really happened. And
Right.
he said, I saw this. This guy came out. He said that. They had words. This guy pulled out a gun and shot the other guy. I was standing right there on the street corner, clear as day. That's the best witness you can have, because they've got no ulterior motive. They've got no conflict of interest. And I felt like Cynthia Horner was that person. And in fact, she said she thought that Tupac was going to be around, and suddenly it was going to be all a big hoax, that he was going to come back at some point, and say, yeah, sorry, just kidding everybody. She really thought that. So she was, in my mind, the perfect person to come in and just crush that theory. just to crush that, make that stick. What was the other one? Like we covered the rivalry between Biggie and Tupac and Faith Evans.
Right.
I was fortunate enough to meet and talk to the wife of the photographer that took that picture of the two of them together. The guy who took that picture he's deceased now, but he was a photographer. And his wife was gracious enough to let us, use that photo. And you know, a picture, like you say, is picture's worth 1,000 words. Is it completely dispositive of an entire situation? No, but you can kind of see by looking at the picture, you can see where they may have had some sort of a challenge. And to Cynthia's point, people take pictures all the time with
I found that
everybody.
interesting. Yeah. In
Yeah, I
in
mean, I could
context
take a
nowadays,
picture
yeah,
with, yeah, I could take a picture of Taylor Swift. Doesn't mean I'm dating her,
exactly.
that kind of thing. So, but back in those days, it had a little more significant of a meaning.
Yes. Yes.
And then of course, we explore that relationship. I think that the show really, and again, how do you cover such a big subject matter in 40 minutes? But I think that's what we've tried to do is kind of go through the major talking points about what people have always heard about Tupac's relationship with Death Row and try to set the record straight about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Because if somebody had explained to Tupac, listen, Tupac, like the security guy did, you need a bulletproof car. Why? I keep telling him, Chris Herzog, security guy, I told Tupac multiple times, get an armored vehicle. Then you don't have to worry about it. What are you going to have one in every city? Yeah, sure. Why
Yeah.
not? You can
Yes.
afford it. Why not? That's practical knowledge. So if
Right.
Tupac didn't do those things, was it because he didn't want to do them or is it because there were other people telling him he didn't need to do them?
I
Okay.
mean, that's what kind of Herzog alluded to. He's being told by people like Suge, no, you don't need it. We can't afford it. But I mean, come on, the company was making, millions upon millions. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, Chris Herzog, he was interesting because the bodyguard group of Beverly Hills, he's guarded, the Kardashians. He's a next level security guy, so he definitely knows what he's talking about as it relates to security anyway.
And that's what I wanted. I wanted a real security guy. I wanted to talk to when I found Chris Herzog, I wanted to talk to a real security guard who was a real bodyguard, not a Reggie Wright Jr., Wright Brave Protective Services bodyguard who lets people get killed while they're protecting services for them,
Right.
but and don't know what they're doing and don't know where people are and don't have the right equipment and everything else that went wrong that night. But I wanted to talk to a bodyguard who has his proverbial act together, who's well respected and well considered in that industry, and have him actually state what the realities are of what the readiness posture for security should have been at that point. Okay. And that's the thing about with Death Row Records and the amount of resources that Death Row had, that to your point about Death Row having all kinds of money. When Death Row has that kind of money to spend, you can hire security consultants all day. You can hire people to say, you should do it this way, you should do it that way. Reggie Wright Jr. is running around, and it's in the later episodes, but he's running around saying he'd never been a bodyguard before. How's that for an admission? You get $250,000 to start a bodyguarding company. You've never
Right.
been a bodyguard before. Well, then what's the next thing you do? You call somebody who is, and you say, dude, now, Suge Knight had been a bodyguard for Bobby Brown. I don't know who taught Suge Knight what he knows about being a bodyguard. Maybe he was working for a company where there were more established executive protection people that he had been around and had taught him how to be a good bodyguard. Clearly, that information didn't get passed on, but you've got these, and I thought it was so important for us to put a security expert who's protected the likes of Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton and these other people that that's no small thing.
No.
Okay. And but to have him compare, and what was interesting is when I called him and I talked to him about this is what I was looking for from an interview perspective and what would you charge me for an interview, et cetera, et cetera. About halfway through the phone call, as we're talking, he says, wait a minute, wait. He says, I'm confused here for a minute. And I said, what's that? He goes, do you want to interview me about security in general, or do you want to interview me about my friendship and relationship with Tupac? And I said, huh? He says, yeah. Do you want to interview me about Tupac, or do you want to interview me about security in general? Because, I thought you were calling me because it's pretty well known that I knew Tupac. I knew who he was. and I had interacted with him and was friends with him. And I said, "Well, friends, like you were best friends?" He go, "No, no, no. We'd go to the same haunts. I'd run into him all the time, and we just struck up a relationship like that." And I said, "Okay." I said, "I had absolutely no idea, dude. I picked your name out of a phone book,
That's
basically,
crazy.
and hit that one." And I said, "Yeah, okay, of course, I want to interview me. I want to interview you." Well, he thought I was bullshitting him, and he said, "Okay, well, I charge X for my interviews." And I said, "Okay." He says, "Okay." I said, "Give me your Venmo." And he said, and he we're still friends to this day. We talk to each other all the time because he said, RJ, he says, "I've never met a person that called my bluff so quickly." He said, "I never thought you would pay for the interview." He's most people try to figure out a way not to pay for doing an interview. "I never thought you'd pay for an interview, much less what I was asking." And I said, "Well, I don't think what you were asking was unreasonable." He goes, "Well, I did." I was like, "Okay, great, thanks." So, but that was a great interview, and it was because of his relationship with Tupac that made, in my opinion, the story even better
Yeah.
because he had a vested interest. This was his friend, even the Tupac's girlfriend. People were around him were saying, "Yes, that's a good idea. Listen to what he's saying. It makes sense."
I mean,
Okay.
even to the point where I'm saying the way they have you set up now, Tupac, you're going to get killed.
Yes,
It wasn't just buy
absolutely.
this truck, but the way you guys are moving right now, you're going to get killed.
Yep. And he would know. That was the thing. And he would know. And you notice, and this is the
And he's
thing
hit him
about
with
it.
the whole, "Hey, I'm not going to live till whatever." Anyway, that's always that fatalistic talk that he always did. But yeah, that was part of his.
Absolutely. That was his response. It was sad that that was his response. But here's the interesting thing about it. The show's been out now for what, a month and a half? Do you know we've never been attacked one time about what Chris Herzog has said? Not one time.
Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that. No one has said no, that isn't true, that the way he was behaving was going to get him killed. Okay. There's been no argument about that at all. So yeah, so that was a great ad. But again, the purpose of episode one, which was again called Death Row Realities, was to try to level the playing field to understand more clearly what was really happening at the time that Tupac was thinking about leaving Death Row Records and when he went to Las Vegas. What was really happening versus what everybody said was happening. Okay. About taking masters from the studio. There was an allegation that Tupac wanted to take his masters from the studio. Okay. Well, masters are very, very large reel tapes at that time. They were huge
Yeah.
and they weighed about 15 pounds a piece. So how many of those are you going to take away just by the fact that you're screaming that you want your masters? There could have been hundreds of those, and good luck getting those. I think what he was talking about is they make a cassette tape of your recording session of that day. I think that they were referring to that as a master, and that's really what he was looking for was
That's the
his
digital
was
audio tapes.
yeah, exactly. He was looking for the small portable ones. And again, he wouldn't have had a good way to play a DAT unless he went to another studio because it's not like you can stick a DAT in your cassette player in your car and play a tune. Okay.
Right.
It doesn't work like that. So we had to get into the masters. Okay, well, what does that mean when you have your masters? And Virgil Roberts said, well, it wouldn't have, Tupac said it down there. There was some controversy over whether or not Death Row thought they had a claim to the masters. And Virgil Roberts set that straight. He didn't think he did. He thinks Tupac had every claim in the world to the masters. So it really, and then it goes back to the strength of the crappy contract that was written. So by the
And
time,
a work for hire agreement, and the lack of a work for hire agreement. If you record it, if
exactly,
that's your stuff, you own it, even though they pay you for it. You own it unless there is a work for hire agreement, which is big.
exactly, yeah, exactly. And so, but I didn't feel like RJ Bond saying it was good enough. I think that if you want to talk about contract, you talk about the guy who got his contract with Dre and Death Row terminated. Okay. That's
Right.
the guy you want to talk to about a recording contract. Is the guy's legendary when it comes to recording contracts. When you talk to a security guy about security perspectives, who do you talk to? You talk to the best security guy you could find. When you want to talk about royalties, you talk to somebody who's an expert in royalties and holdbacks, publicity. New York, you talk about you go to the top publicist in New York, Cynthia Horner, and you ask her about what was going on in New York at that time, because who would not know more than a person who was in the industry at that time. Who would not know more about it?
Right.
So, so I felt like by the time you leave episode one, I think you've got all the knowledge that you need to have about what was going on in Tupac's head when he went to leave for Las Vegas.
Well, and another element, as episode one sets this climate and environment at death row, almost a week before he is shot. I mean, it's part of what happened in New York, the MTV Music Awards, him
Mm-hmm.
hearing Snoop on the radio basically saying he has no beef with Big. And a lot of stuff goes down. Tupac and Suge having kind of an altercation with Michael, which Michael Moore says if he was not in the room, Suge would have put his hands on him. And
Yep.
apparently, the exclamation point of that conversation or that altercation was Tupac was like, you know what? After Machiavelli, you can have all the rights to this thing. I am out after this. And then they hop on a plane, head back to LA. Snoop is saying, because of this rift, he doesn't even talk to him on the flight. Suge doesn't let Snoop's security fly on the plane with him. He's thinking they're going to do something to him. So this is the climate and the environment that when they land in LA, and Tupac also tells Michael Moore, who was another one of death row security, I'm not going to be in Vegas. I'm not sure what happened that convinced Pac to go to Vegas, but that's how pretty much episode one ends. And again, as we set this climate of, was Suge Knight and Death Row potentially responsible? I said this to you in an off-air tweet or a text. The hugest red flag for me, and we're going to get into this later on down the line, but this episode one ends with Frank Alexander talking about a noon meeting they had in Las Vegas on September 7th, the day of the shooting, at attorney George Kalesi's office, where him, Michael Moore, and other security guards are told not to carry their weapons. Why would you ask your security guards not to carry your weapons? It's like, hey, scuba diver, you can go do this scuba thing, but you can't do it with an oxygen tank. Like, this is a
Right.
part of my job.
Don't wear your air tanks. Don't take any air with you.
This is a part of my job.
No, it's good. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's a key point in the story. And to this day, I've never heard a reasonable, concise, soundbite explanation of why that meeting even took place.
Because it had never
Okay.
happened before, as they said when they went to Vegas.
Well, there were security meetings. There was generally security meetings when they went to Vegas. They would get the bodyguards, Death Row Dave
I mean, a
Matthews,
lawyer's
put
office
that in
telling them not to
perspective.
carry,
Yeah, they would do it at
disarming them.
a hotel room, and they did it at TGI Fridays, and they would find a place to get everybody together, and this is what they would say. Never before had they met in an attorney's office on a Saturday. And anybody who's dealt with attorneys before know that attorneys don't work in their offices on Saturday, at least not open for business. Maybe they're working a case or something, they got to be there. But generally speaking, attorneys' offices and attorneys are not available on Saturdays. George Kalisis was an unusual individual because he was trying to broker a deal for the owners of Club 662, and that was the nightclub that Suge Knight wanted to buy. Originally, I'm trying to remember the name of the original club. I'll probably think of it in a minute, but the lady that owned the club, Helen Thomas, um, she was looking to sell the club, and if she couldn't sell the nightclub, she had to get somebody that could lease the nightclub, but just leasing the nightclub did not clear you for an alcohol license, a license to sell alcohol. You still had to qualify for that separately. And they were very reluctant to give licenses out to convicted felons, to people that had a criminal past, because they were trying to get rid of the mafia. This is not talking about Las Vegas. They
Right.
were trying to get rid of the mafia, and they were trying to get rid of the stench of the mafia over Las Vegas as a mob town and all that. They're trying to get rid of that. So you show up, you've got a big criminal record, we're not going to give you a liquor license. That's how it was. And so what they would have to do was they would have to open Club 662, basically rent it from Helen Thomas as a one-time event, like you would go to a movie theater for a screening of something and it's a
Right.
one-time event. And you would pay them for this one-time event and you pay her to rent the place, but then you would file a permit with the county to say, well, we're not going to sell alcohol on a regular basis, but this is a one-time event. And yes, there will be alcohol there. So can you give us the permit for that one time? And that was basically how Death Row had rented the Club 662 over and over again. They'd done it, 4 or 5 times. It wasn't like they
Mhm.
were doing it every weekend. But they had done it enough that they had relabeled or got new signage for the club, called it Club 662. And it was only open certain times, and that would usually be around when there were fight nights, etc. But when Helen Thomas, she couldn't sell to Suge Knight because Suge Knight couldn't get a liquor license. There was a lot of problem there. So they had to do these things, but they got basically when you sign up for a permit, Jeff, in Clark County, when you sign up for a use permit, you basically have to have an event that's something. You can't just say, well, it's Thursday night and that's our event. You have to have a legitimate event that you're doing. So they created the night of the fight, September 6th. They created the event to be a fundraising opportunity for a place called Barry's Boxing, which was a an LVMPD officer who had started his own boxing gym for inner city youth and troubled youth, and that was the alleged fundraiser that they were going to base that
Mm.
um, event on to get the event permit. That was the whole thing. So you hear all this talk about this Barry. How much money did Barry's Boxing get from the event? Don't know. Do I have a speculation of how much they got? Yeah, they got nothing. Okay.
Donut.
They got nothing because it was just another that he may have been paid up front, whatever the case. I don't think they saw any real benefit from it. And it was, but it was enough to get it on the paper and get it approved. And George Kalisis, when we talk about this in Assassination 2, The Reckoning, George Kalisis, the attorney that was there on that Saturday where they had the security meeting, he was also the acting president of the Friends of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Okay. Friends of the
Mm.
LVMPD. And what that was is that was a booster club for the Las Vegas police that would buy them extra radios, they'd buy them bulletproof vests, they'd send their dogs to dog training. They would basically pay for things that the city wasn't willing to pay for Vegas PD. They were a booster club, so to speak, for that. And how interesting is it that a criminal defense attorney, George Kalisis, is actually the president of the booster club for the police? Okay. The
Very
guy who's
interesting.
giving them money. So you got an attorney. I won't say he's crooked or not crooked, but he has some dubious representation there. Okay,
Yeah.
Anthony Spilatro. He's represented some real humdingers in his time. Okay,
Oh wow, didn't know that.
some real mob guys in his time. Okay, no, maybe that was Oscar Goodman that represented Spilatro. I think that was Oscar Goodman, the mayor of Vegas, represented Spilatro. That I want to make sure I get my story straight on that. But George Kalisis had also represented criminal defendants, and that's part of his gig. He was a criminal defense attorney. He was also a tax attorney. He did taxes. But at the end of the day, he was pretty well connected with the mob. Let's just put it out there. George
Right.
Kalisis has been and has been pretty well connected with the mob. Helen Thomas had owned Club 62. Her husband, Mr. Thomas, was mob related. So, yeah, he's got the ties there. But you got a
Wow.
guy who's tied up with the mob and tied up with criminal defense, actually fundraising for the Vegas police. Okay. No conflict of
Wow.
interest there.
No,
No,
not at
no,
all.
no obligation for Vegas police to do anything about it, right? So George Kalisis and Friends of Vegas Police Department put it together and give Suge Knight, his other client, um, the license to do that thing. So, there was a whole lot going on around that. And, you've heard Reggie Wright Jr., who's the head of Death Row Security, say that, he was there at Club 662 to make sure that nothing happened and that they had no reason to lose that liquor license or to not have another event there. Because that's what had happened. If something had broke out at Club 662, the county would just never give them another event permit. They'd just say, you're not doing this anymore. So he's sitting there saying, oh, he's trying to make sure everything doesn't happen. And he does the weirdest thing because he tells the guards not to carry weapons. The most recent explanation I've got about this guards of death row being told not to carry any weapons was because they were doing this thing at Club 662 and no one could be armed. Okay. Well, Reggie Wright Jr. and Michael Moore were both armed at Club 662.
Yeah, Michael was one who refused. Like, I'm not taking my gun off me.
Yes, when
Mike
they
was
had
told
the
to put it in
meeting,
his car or back at the hotel or whatever, but Michael's the only one who really resisted.
And where did they take him? They sent him over to Club 662, where they were told not to have any weapons.
Right.
So go figure. And that's just one of the many inconsistencies in the story. But at the end of the day, they had this meeting, and all the bodyguards were told not to carry any weapons. Well, so with a guy like Frank Alexander, that's a big ask because he was licensed to carry a weapon and all of that. I don't know if he was licensed in Nevada or not. I know he was licensed in California, and there may have been some reciprocal favor that they may have granted them. But at the end of the day, these guys all carried their weapons anyway.
Yeah, they're
You're
security
not going
guards.
to well, you're not going to tell any of the entourage and what they call homeboy security. You're not going to tell them don't carry any weapons and then go, oh, okay, yeah, we won't do that. Yeah, we'll be good now. That's not going to happen anyway.
Well, and
So, yeah,
as
go ahead.
episode one ends, you have Reggie Wright, who has this meeting around noon at George Clessy's office, and as episode one ends, we hear Reggie stating to allhiphop.com that he never said to disarm these guys. And as you
Right.
say at the very end, Michael Moore said something is not right. And as we end this first episode, as we break down episode one, I'm kind of teasing something that they talk about in episode two, because somebody says in episode two, within minutes of Reggie finding out that Tupac has been shot, he rides to the hospital with this attorney, George Colesis.
Yep. You get a lot of the same players' names that run through a 30-year narrative. I give you one case in point as we wrap up. You had a Los Angeles sheriff's officer by the name of Mike Coet, that was an active part of the early days of the investigation of the shooting. And he was an advocate, along with the Compton PD, that a certain gentleman, we'll talk about later, was responsible for the shooting. And I find it very intriguing that 25 years later, when LAPD Detective Russell Poole, which we'll talk about him later as well, who
Yes.
was working the Biggie and the Tupac cases at the time, years later, after he retires from the police department, he quits the police department, and years later, he meets with the LA County sheriffs over some new information that he has regarding the Tupac and or the Biggie shootings, that suddenly out of nowhere, Mike Coet appears in this meeting 25 years later. This same guy who was at the very beginning of things, he suddenly makes this reappearance the day that Russ Poole drops dead at that sheriff's meeting.
No way.
Yeah. And that I do not believe in coincidences. I
No,
just
no.
don't. And how a meeting that was scheduled, and again, we'll talk much more about this later, but the 30-second story is that that meeting was actually scheduled by Michael Carlin, who was a friend of Russ's and knew Lee Baca, who was it was either Lee Baca or Jim McDonald. I can't remember which one, but one of the sheriffs, the actual sheriff of LA County. And he had set that meeting up at the LA County Sheriff, the top guy did. So how this information about this meeting managed to make its way through a 15,000 employee sheriff's department to where it got to the ear of one guy who happened to be one of the first investigators trying to misdirect the investigation in the first place. Suddenly he's in a meeting with Russ Poole. Russ Poole drops dead 25 years later. How?
That's
How does
wild.
that even work? I can't even, I've tried to draw it on a chalkboard, couldn't figure it out.
That's crazy, man. So this is where we conclude episode one of the docu series Tupac cover up, and we are going to be jumping into next week, episode two, false flags. RJ, I cannot thank you enough for your time, ladies and gentlemen. We are just getting started, and I hope you enjoyed this. We got more to come. Buckle up.
Sounds great. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, bud. Take care, guys. Stay tuned. You know what it is. There will always be more.